SOGI International Task Force News Desk. I'm Brad Wylder. Today, we're going to discuss with Jon Uhler the language, how things have changed, how you control the language, you ultimately control the narrative. There's a lot of different things to the narrative. There's a lot of different things to the language. John's going to help sort that all out today, from the trans movement and the language that they use there to the trans community, as well as even the trans families that are involved. As well, there's the affirmation part of it, plus the conversion therapy, which is another language on its own. So we've got a lot to cover in this show. Right now, though, please welcome to the show Jon Uhler, who is the SOGI Task Force lead clinical mental health professional and deals with all kinds of different issues, not only for the SOGI Task Force, but over his 30-year plus career. So, Jon, welcome to the show today. Good to have you back.
Brad, it's always good to be back. I appreciate your efforts on behalf of the task force, and we'll try to cover some good material for parents, for people that want to know about this aspect, which is really one of the most crucial aspects, dealing with the trans movement, or what we call the trans deception.
Well, we've seen things that have actually, we've seen some of the protests that have happened at like drag queen story times, for example, and there seems to be a continuous, constant language from the pro side, but the alternate side, which again is the dislike side, they've got their own language too, and their language it had to be altered a little bit as well, and that's part of that communication that needs to happen to kind of get people to understand that you can get caught in their language and really almost not even be in the fight because they've got you. And once they've got you, or as you like to call it, I think, sip the juice. Was it the juice?
Drink the Kool-Aid.
Drink the Kool-Aid. There we go. Exactly right. So where do we go? Where does this start? And how do we get here with this language changing and them creating a language of their own?
Right. And even why? Why would they do that? Number one, to have the strategic advantage. And that presupposes that we're dealing with an agenda. And we are. The average person, the average parent, doesn't realize, because of the PR campaign, that this movement is man-made, this movement is contrived, and it's heading somewhere. We really have an agenda, meaning we're combating an agenda, but what we have on our hands is an agenda. And the agenda ultimately is for the private parts and private spaces of women and children. They are encroaching upon what used to be off limits. And therefore, because they are crossing boundaries by nature, crossing what kind of boundaries? The first would be the parent-child relationship. This is a very intentional effort to divide parent from child, really to usurp parental authority. Why? Because they want access to kids. So you have, as we mentioned last time, we have a number of special interests that will benefit if they can have access, unfettered access to kids. We talked about that. We looked at a chart. What are all the special interests?
Right.
Along with that are really very deviant men, sexually deviant men, that want to move any protective adults, especially women. Men should be protective. You and I are protective. That's why we're doing this. But sadly, men are in the minority of those that are standing up, kind of waking up and smelling the coffee. So hopefully, as you and I and the task force are able to educate, hopefully we will awaken the men to realize that the Huns The hordes are at the door, and they are after our kids. The way they have chosen to do this is not by overtly storming the gates, though you look at some of these protests, right? And you've got these trans activists and the Antifa folks.
Yeah.
Antifa's holding AK-47s or whatever, or AR-15s.
Yeah.
So they'll storm stuff. Look at what happened in Portland and Oregon. So they'll definitely storm things. But what they're doing is it really is a battle for the minds, the hearts and the minds, and then ultimately the public discourse. Why? Because if you can win the public discourse, you then can begin to spin a narrative. You then craft public opinion, which allows you to change and mold public sentiment, which then allows you to ultimately influence policy on a local level and then on a federal, state, or provincial or federal level, which then allows you to begin to shape, literally, legislation that will codify things in your favor, which then will influence the courts, which will influence the possibility of civil and criminal penalties, which will then shape and limit people's behavior and freedoms, and ultimately render parents mute and powerless, if not placed in jail, if they attempt to step up and stand up for their kids once they realize their kids are being sucked into what amounts to a cult-like system.
Now, this is already happening, isn't it, John? This is already happening.
Correct. And absolutely. Right. There's a father in Canada, there's a father in the U.S. who have not only lost custody of their kids, one father in Canada has been put in jail. I think even as we are recording this, he's sitting in jail right now. Why? Because he refused to use the magic words, the words that are politically correct. So this is George Orwell. This is 1984 that's coming to pass now.
Yeah.
It's newspeak. And George Orwell really captured the feel of that whether dictators or anybody that's going to ram something down somebody's throat, they're going to change the language, because if you change the language, then you change the way people think, which affects their behavior. It affects their feelings, their emotions about it.
Right.
You capture the language, and every cult knows this. You capture the language, now you have someone. And ultimately, what a cult, what a manipulator, what a sociopath, psychopath, whatever term you want to use, they ultimately want to manipulate you mentally and emotionally. We used to call that brainwashing. They want to manipulate you in such a way that they get you to do what they want, because there's two ways you can get somebody to do what's not in their best interest. One is by force, where I take a gun, I point it at you, and I tell you to give me your wallet. So let's say I'm after your finances. Or let's say you step onto my car lot, I'm going to manipulate you out of additional cash. I'm going to upsell you. Right. So I can either take your wallet or get you, takes more work, more finesse. I'm going to get you to actually voluntarily relieve and remove from your person financial aspects of you. If I'm all the more persuasive as a manipulator or cult leader, I can actually get you to allow me to remove your breasts or your body parts or your penis and testicles. Keith Raniere and Allison Mack manipulated very intelligent women to lay down on a table in the cult Nixium. It was a self-empowerment organization. That's how it was sold, but it was really a sex cult. And he would work women to a point. He had this inner circle. We used to call it a harem. And these women, one was actually from British Columbia. She wrote a book called Scarred. And they would lay down on a table without anesthesia And a female doctor would cauterize what would amount to a brand. She would brand them in the groin area. You can look this up online. There was a very unique brand that she would put. Little did these women know it was the initials of Keith Raniere and Allison Mack. There's a direct parallel to what's going on within the trans movement, where you have kids, but it's all the more tragic. It's one thing to have people manipulate adults. It's all the more tragic when somebody manipulates vulnerable kids. That's why we're concerned, and they do that through language. And cults will do this. So there's a direct parallel between what we see going on in the trans movement and cults. They're using the same methods of manipulation, so they go after the language. And that's why those of us that haven't kept up on it, I can't even keep up. They keep coming up with new terms, cisgender and whatever. Okay, so the very first thing we kind of heard was this binary, non-binary thing. Mm-hmm. And if you don't understand what that, it's okay, but we're going to help educate you. But it's all for the purpose of manipulating and beginning to capture, as it were, the narrative, to script a narrative to where ultimately we are on defense. We're put on our heels. We meaning protective, reasonable adults. Mm-hmm. Again, we're not against anything other than people who will take advantage of women and children. So we are not phobic. We don't have any fear, right? We are protective. If adults want to go and do things with adults, they can do that. We may have our own personal opinions, but that's not what the task force is all about. The task force is helping to shine the light on an agenda that has its designs and as its goal to capture kids, as it were, in a mindset that will not be in their best interest, that they will have skin in the game for someone else, not in their best interest, and it will separate and undermines parental authority.
Right. So there's something that you said recently which caught my attention. There's a right way to present this whole language issue that actually catches them off guard, and it's done in a way that they're speechless by the time you're done, because they understand where this phrase comes from, and they have no way to justify it from there. So let's talk a little bit about that phrase, because I think that language is again what we're discussing tonight and figuring out. So what are your thoughts on that?
There we go. And again, what we want people to understand is if adults want to do things with adults, that's fine. It's their issue.
Right. We've been through that. Yep.
There we go. Okay. So we have a group, a collection of groups. We have an agenda that's after kids, that's after really, again, their hearts and their minds, ultimately their bodies, for profit or prey. Mm-hmm. They've figured out a way to gain access to kids where otherwise we could call the police on them. Right? If somebody snatches your child, we can call the police. If someone grooms your child, that means mentally and emotionally manipulates your child to where they draw your child away from you and towards them, they're still taking your child away, but doing it in such a way that's very subtle. So the power is in the language, because they are actively manipulating your child,
right,
and doing so in a way where it's very hard to be able to say what they're doing and tell them hands off. We have to call them out. So we have to, they're actively drawing kids away. And so when we step up, not physically towards them, but in terms of we're going to intervene with policies, we're going to give pushback, healthy protective pushback against the ways they are encroaching, such as drag queen story hour coming into schools, such as furries, such as the Gay Straight Alliance, GSA school clubs.
Right.
These are all methods of grooming and manipulating kids. So we have to be able to give pushback to get these people, ultimately there's adults behind all this, to get them out of the schools, to get them away from our kids. So we have to combat language, because what they will do is they want the kids.
Yeah.
And we have to tell them, no, you can't have our kids. So they will start to use language that will put us on our heels to cause us to back off.
Mm-hmm.
The message that people need to keep in mind and stay on. So stay on message. Because when we tell someone that guy in drag should not come into the school and have an assembly, we don't want him dancing in drag for a school assembly.
Right.
Why? They're grooming kids. They will say what? Because they want to be in there. Why? Because they're going to groom kids. Well, they're not going to take no for an answer. So they're going to try to make sure they get their foot in the door by saying, we're phobic, we're anti-this, we're bigots, so that we shut our mouths so they get their foot in the door and they get their little tutus, they're able to prance on stage. Okay. The primary message that I say is the core of what we're saying is this. Protective adults raise the bar on child safety. They don't lower it. Anything that causes an adult to lower the bar to where a predator, a manipulator, is able to have access to a kid, easier access, is not someone who is safe and does not have the child or parent's best interest in mind. We cannot compromise on child safety. So all this pushback that we will get, well, once we step in, the answer ultimately is the phrase, the concept, the construction of a sentence that says, we are about child safety. We're about the protection of women and children. What you are doing is placing at risk the safety of children. That is something that we cannot stand for. So if an adult is trying to encroach upon a child, bring concepts, bring ideas, we have to let them know that they're jeopardizing ultimately the safety of kids. So if it's a philosophy, if it's a drag queen story hour that's coming into the school, if it's furries, if it's whatever they're bringing in, especially the sexualized content, they're jeopardizing the risk of the kids, because it also makes it difficult for mandated reporters to be able to adequately discern what constitutes a potential predator.
I'm recalling a word, unduly. Does that ring a bell?
I think so. So, about influencing. There we go.
Right.
Okay. And that's there we go. So that's going to be another thing, which is true. All of these are just fact-based. Those that are trying to capture the minds of our kids toward the negative, to where they can be exploited, are unduly influencing. If you are evidencing sexualized behavior, you are unduly influencing our children. If you are introducing concepts of a sexualized nature, you are unduly influencing the mind and the emotions of kids. You are not entitled to, you are not paid to, you are not called. If you are someone that's trying to introduce these concepts that ultimately have to do with sex and sexuality, you are unduly influencing our children. And you have no right to unduly influence them. That's a very important phrase, because they will call us bigots. They'll call us homophobes. They'll call us transphobes. We're not. We're very protective. And our response needs to be, why are you dumbing down or lowering the bar on child protection? You are unduly influencing these kids.
And that's a key phrase, isn't it?
That's right. That's right. So unduly influencing is very, very important, because they will throw a term that we talked about, and we'll cover that, which is conversion therapy, or converting.
Mm-hmm.
They've captured that term, that word. Unfortunately, they sort of own that. So their working definition, and people need to understand this because they have been effective in getting legislation passed in a number of different countries that is called anti-conversion therapy laws. Canada has done that now. The US and some states have passed that. So a therapist, so it's aimed at therapists, quite frankly. Why? Because therapists are the gatekeepers, at least for now. Gatekeepers of what? The moving sidewalk that's heading on for the trans movement. You have to picture the trans movement as a moving sidewalk.
Right.
Kids enter onto that moving sidewalk at different points, but it all leads to a single end point, and that end point is a surgeon's gurney. They'll be sterilized along the way. So the trans movement, when you boil it down, it's sending kids from point A to point Z, and they will end up at the end, if they follow this all the way through, they'll end up sterilized, amputated, and a pharmaceutical patient or a pharmaceutical consumer and a lifetime medical patient for life. So they will be they will enrich big pharma for life. They will have to stay on these cross-sex hormones because they're going through a sex change, and it's artificial. So that's, parents need to understand, that's what the trans movement is all about. That's why we're fighting this.
So the trendiness of all of this, language and discussion, new words, new pronouns, new language, and that new language is definitely causing concern. As you've spoken here tonight, we've kind of got into the trans movement. We've talked a little bit about how the family is involved with this language change. We've talked about the affirmation a little bit as well. And then we got into the conversion therapy right there at the end. So, we've kind of gone full circle in a sense of having really no understanding about really what has happened with the language, to now getting an understanding and even how to combat that, which is what the SOGI International Task Force is all about, which is helping parents stand up, helping parents take initiative themselves, helping parents, challenge the school boards and the school librarians and the teachers that are bringing these books in the back door, and the whole movement, which is again a very disturbing movement that is they're coming for our kids. That's the bottom line, is that. And like you said earlier, whoever controls that language controls the narrative. Right now, would you say that they're in control of the narrative, or are we going to be able to get that back?
I would say they're in control, but we can get it back by highlighting, by knowing their tactics, by being able to bring logic and reason to bear. We can capture that. So as long as we start to learn, and we can in subsequent segments, we can begin to parse what are these different terms: binary and non-binary, trans kids, all these. So we'll be looking at these different terms, unpacking them, so that when you hear kids say these words, and then what are the tactics, we will also look in future segments, we'll look at what are the tactics that these, what I call predator apologists, or the pushers, the trans pushers, what are their tactics, so that you can be prepared, whether if you go to a location where kids meet and they're having a drag queen, so drag queen story hour,
right,
or on a site at school or a school board or with a teacher or a principal, what are the typical things they're going to do to get us off kilter, to put us on our heels so we're no longer balanced, as it were. So kind of like in martial arts, as long as now again, we're not combating anybody physically.
No.
Okay. But as long as we're centered, then it doesn't matter what they say because we're going to be unfazed. So it'll be really important. And we will begin that process as far as our series on unpacking the language and helping people understand what are some of these terms mean. How can we combat this so that when you receive this pushback, you will feel comfortable, you'll feel educated, you'll feel confident, you will be empowered to effectively put them on their heels on the defense so that they unmask themselves. Because once you do, you will see them escalate and they show their true colors very, very quickly.
You said put them back on their heels, and I like to think now that we're going to put parents back on their feet and give them a good, solid ground to stand on and, challenge this in a way that hasn't been attempted yet. They're doing it at a few drag queen story hours. Of course, we've seen that, but, we've seen a lot more resistance in the States from parents. Here in Canada, of course, it's not quite the same yet, but again, it's exposing this and getting people to understand that this is something that's affecting all schools nationwide and throughout the West, period, and around the world. But ultimately, I think that people in the West are still a little bit asleep.
That's right. And we need to wake up because kids are being harmed.
Jon Uhler, I want to thank you very much for being on the SOGI International Task Force News Desk again. Always a great pleasure to talk to you. You're so knowledgeable and bring so much experience to our task force, and we love having you on board. We'll get together again and do another episode real soon. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Brad. Appreciate it so much.